Is my audio coming through?
Welcome, everyone, to Rational Space Disputations. It's Frances Widdowson here. And for people who have not seen the other episodes, I'll let you know about the format, which is for the first hour, I'm going to ask my guest or guests questions. And then after the hour has taken place, I'm going to turn over the controls to my guest or guests, and they're going to ask me questions just so that we can keep it fair. And if anything's been left out, it can get covered. We try to get into some areas of disagreement if we have them, just because people shouldn't be afraid to explore ideas with which they disagree. And for people who don't know me, I used to be a professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University, and I was terminated on December 20th, and my case is going to arbitration in January of 2023. So for today's session, I have on, in an unusual format, because usually we just have two people, we have two guests. Will McNally, who is a full professor of business and economics at Wilfrid Laurier University, and David Millard Haskell, who is also a professor at Wilfrid Laurier, but a professor of liberal arts. So welcome, Will and David, to Rational Space Disputations.
It's a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I just want to have a warning. There will be no jokes about three ways or anything like that. That will be considered to be harassment in this episode.
Understood.
Just so you're warned. But look, that kind of humor is very dangerous these days. So
Okay,
yes.
there goes that point.
So before we begin in these discussions, I thought I would get you both to sort of talk about yourselves and what you do and what your interests are. The reason why we're having both of you, of course, on this program is because you're both intensely involved in the Wilfrid Laurier free speech saga. And so anyway, if you could just tell our audience what you're all about, that would be great. So
Will, go ahead.
You want to go first, Will?
Okay, so my specialty is finance within the School of Business and Economics. So I had no training in critical theory or any of this. I was just watching. I became aware of the free speech issue when Ezra Levant and Mark Stein got into trouble due to complaints filed with the Human Rights Commissions, and that was, when was that, like 2010? And then, I watched what happened in 2016 at Yale with Nicholas Christakis, and then the Lindsay Shepherd affair happened at Laurier, and it was a rude awakening for me, and it kind of pushed me into this fight, and I'm just playing catch up at this point.
All right. Yes. And David?
So my area of research is, well, I'm cross-appointed, first of all, to both digital media and journalism and religion and culture. I'm not a theologian. People always hear religion and culture and think you're a theologian. I'm actually a sociologist of religion. And the media piece is I have done a lot of research into media bias. And there's some nice crossover there in terms of religion and media bias. And in relation to this free speech issue, it was probably around 2015, 2016 that I had my awakening. I didn't become woke, but I became awake. And what I saw was that increasingly my colleagues were becoming intolerant to viewpoint diversity. And one of the first times I noticed it was related to the scandal around Jordan Peterson. I was at a faculty meeting, and I'd actually just written a piece for the Toronto Star in support of Jordan Peterson. And suddenly I found that people weren't meeting my gaze. And I found that, nobody wanted to sit with me at the lunch table. So and then 2016 happened, and that was the election of Donald Trump. And suddenly I was receiving emails from my colleagues in journalism discussing the Marcuse paper, Repressive Tolerance, which suggests that essentially you should censor your ideological foes. And keep in mind, this was coming from journalism professors.
Yeah.
So anyway, then as Will mentioned, it's actually been great because to have a comrade in arms, I'm using the word comrade, it's becoming more vogue, isn't it? So anyway, Will and I have really tried to stick together because it's lonely out there. Well, as you know, Frances, we are a minority. Those of us who actually think that diversity of ideas have a place on the universe, not just have a place, they are the root.
Yes. I wonder about the minority aspect. Do you think that there are more people in support of, open inquiry than actually appears? Like I'm constantly trying to figure this out as to, is it just that people are kind of afraid and if they just were given the support, or is it just they don't care? Like, is it really true that there's just such a small percentage of people who care about this in the universities?
That's such a good question, and I'm grappling with that big time right now. But I have to provide you a little background here. We had a workplace consultant do interviews all through last year, and there were a number of issues, usual stuff, and they came out with their presentation in December, and they had two recommendations. They said, first, you got to do more equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and you have to inculcate a culture of respect, they said. And we've seen that at St. Mary's, and it was used as a club with which to hit Mark Mercer. I wrote an essay trying to explain to my colleagues, it was like a letter, explaining to them what EDI is and why this is bad for our school and our university. And I had the opportunity to sort of read it into the minutes in a faculty meeting in mid-March. And I closed by saying, we don't need another code of conduct to deal with one another with empathy and respect. We just need to abide by the words spoken over 2,000 years ago, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And my dean came on right after I finished and said, well, Will, I disagree with everything you just said. I guess including what Jesus said. And I had three people reach out to me in support, and they all kind of said the same thing. They said they broadly agree with what I was saying, and they thought that there was a lot more support for liberal values, but that my not my tone, but I was too tough in my comments. And what I was doing was really just defining EDI and showing the fruit from that tree. You're drawing a lot on James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and the definitions that James has developed on his New Discourses website. So I didn't really feel like, what do you mean too tough? Like I'm just the prophet here. I'm just reporting what's happening and helping you interpret it. These aren't my ideas. And so I don't know what to think about these people. I had one really interesting chat with one colleague, and she's a woman of color. And so she's really offended by the sort of soft bigotry of low expectations. And it's her plan to march into the office of the vice president of EDI and just have an argument with him about this and how opposed she is to discriminatory hiring because of that. But she doesn't know anything about critical theory. She doesn't understand the roots of these ideas. She really doesn't know what she's talking about. But she thinks she can kind of reason it out. She knows what those words mean. She can make the arguments from first principles. She assumes good faith on the other side that they're going to engage with her at a rational level and have a debate. So there's a certain kind of arrogance, is it, that we academics have because we're so smart in one small area, we assume that we know everything about every other area. No one had any questions for me after I read my letter, and nobody wanted to learn more, or they didn't want a citation to another source. You know, I would have told them to read Lindsay and Pluckrose. So I'm really at a loss.
I'm surprised you were able to read that out. Actually,
Well, it was
that is
sneaky.
a surprising. Like this is like I've had situations where I've tried to, do things, and there's really been attempts to, make sure I don't finish and that sort of thing. So that's kind of amazing in its own right that you were able to do that. But just so that because our listeners might not be entirely aware of this EDI kind of area, or as some people call it, DI, diversity, inclusion, and equity. What is that, and why is it so dangerous? Why do you think it's so dangerous? Because it does sound kind of good on the surface. Maybe David, you can.
Yeah, I apologize. My internet kicked me out last time, and so I agree with Will. One last thing, just about your question, Frances. Do I think that there are more people out there who actually support these values? And my answer unequivocally is no. In fact, I think it's we're probably overestimating. So I'll give you an example. Eric Kaufman, he's a social scientist at the University of London. He just did a study where he looked at universities in the US, universities in the UK, and Canada. And when he looked at younger professors, he found that, so these are professors under 40 years of age. So these are the new breed, the next generation. Roughly half were more authoritarian than their predecessors. And by that, I mean, they thought it was completely normal, completely acceptable to fire someone who was espousing quote unquote conservative values. So it looks like it's going to get much worse. The pool of free thinkers, of people who value ideology or diversity of ideology, it's shrinking. It's getting
What
worse.
was the percentage? Did he give a percentage of?
Yeah, well, he
I
said,
think the question is, do you think that just that all ideas should be discussed at a university, or do you think that some ideas should be not allowed to be aired?
He was, from my understanding of the study, and I would commend people to go and look. It's called Academic Freedom in Crisis was the title of the study. Eric Kaufman, lead researcher, but I believe what he actually did specifically, he wanted to know what you would do to a conservative colleague.
Oh yeah.
Now, conservative is an interesting term these days, right? A conservative is anyone who does not toe the line on a very progressive agenda. So a conservative could be someone who says, I really believe that a woman is rooted in biology. Well, that's now there are radical feminists who would qualify themselves on the left who say that, right? Yeah. But under this new warped understanding where anything that isn't aggressively far left is conservative, then it's all put into that basket.
Yeah. Well, conservative used to mean people who value tradition. So that's a big part of conservatism. And it's kind of interesting because, as you know, I'm a historical materialist and I'm not a conservative, but I'm starting to appreciate a little bit some of the traditional, like you don't want to just burn it all down. Like there are the Enlightenment, rationality, science, these sorts of things. These are not things that the left has been historically opposed to. So it's becoming quite muddy now. And I think we don't really have a very clear understanding of this kind of phenomenon. But there have been attempts to kind of say, and it's the political compass test, which is a little bit crude, but it does, I think, identify you have the left and the right, which is about whether you would like more ownership, common ownership over property. That's kind of left-right issue. And then you have the authoritarian, and they say authoritarian libertarian. So, things like free speech, those kinds of issues. And, most of the people that I know are are left, but they're also libertarian. Like they score libertarian, like many members of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. So I think that's kind of got to be kept in mind a little bit when we're talking about, the different kinds of perspectives that we see at the university. But I'm quite surprised that it's so high, the kind of the authoritarian nature.
Right.
Because my
Well,
sense, just talking to people, this is just anecdotal, that there's about 20% that are hardcore totalitarians, like people who will, try to bring in legislation, try to, deplatform all these sorts of things. And then, there's about, I guess, 10% or so who are quite, willing to stand behind open inquiry. And then it seems like there's a large kind of middle area of people who.
But what I'd say, Frances, is for both you and I, for you and me, our friends are probably leaning older, right? The people that we're associating with are professors that have been in there 20 years, maybe, more often. And I think that this new crop of professors under 40, they're a whole different breed. And as Eric Kaufman has found, around half are saying, if you're holding these quote unquote conservative values, you should be fired. I'm okay with that. Increasingly, when I use the word conservative, I think it's that I want to conserve the traditional use of a definition. I want to conserve a definition of a word.
Yeah.
Where racism used to mean that you would actually wield epithets at someone, that you thought a particular group, right? So conserving language, because so much of this is about language.
Yeah. So speaking of language, so Will, this diversity, inclusion, equity, like what do you think that is, and why do you think it's so dangerous?
Well, the words sound lovely, don't they? Inclusive means welcoming, equity means fairness, diversity means a variety of things. But that's not how they're used in the university context. Inclusion means censorship. In the Lindsay Shepherd affair, the supporters of Lindsay were broadly under the banner of free speech. The Rainbow Center, which was the home of the trans opponents and the trans activists, they said that there was that free speech constituted epistemic violence and couldn't be on the campus. The campus wasn't safe with people espousing free speech. The ideas and the supporters needed to be removed. So inclusion really means censorship. And that's the only way you can keep a space safe from harmful ideas. Equity is just straight up adjusting shares to make everyone equal. It's not quite right, though. It's like
discrimination. It's just bold-faced discrimination.
Because targeting, often called targeting. So you have quotas of numbers of percentages, proportional. It's sort of seen as things should reflect the proportion of the population, and therefore, well, no one's saying that more men should be brought into the nursing program. That's not really what's happening. It's more for in areas where people of color, women, etc., are underrepresented in various things. So that's that. And diversity, what is meant by diversity?
Well, the way I understand it is that you have to have authentic voices from each intersectional group. So it's not enough just to get people of color it's not enough to get a representative of that identity group, but because they could be like a John McWhorter if you're thinking of people of color. Well, John he's not woke. So he wouldn't constitute a diverse hire. What we need is authentic voices who are trained in the critical theory and have that standpoint epistemology. They have their way of knowing.
Yeah.
That's diversity.
Okay. Okay.
So we see it, there's discriminatory hiring going on at Laurier right now and UW. At Laurier, it's called Inclusive Excellence, the program. And I like that because it's sort of got that Hegelian dialectic, inclusive really being the opposite of excellence. But they're going to hire 6 Black faculty members and 6 Indigenous faculty members. And it doesn't matter what discipline, but you know that almost all 12 of them are going to be trained in critical theory, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how you have diverse people in terms of their background, but if they say the wrong thing, then they're gone after almost more vigorously than the non-BIPOC or than the non people that don't have these kinds of identities. So there is very much of a sense of the ideas that are correct. That seems to be the essential kind of thing that is sought after. But yeah.
And I want to go back to Will's point that the incredibly dangerous problem with this kind of inclusive hiring, diversity hiring, is that it then casts doubt on the merit and competency of the person hired, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you are an Indigenous scholar who does excel in a particular field. Let's say it's physics, and your publications show that. But now everyone can doubt whether or not you were hired because you're good at your job or because your particular ethnicity was what was needed for the quota. And I think that that's incredibly humiliating as well.
Yeah.
That someone should be subjected to that kind of doubt.
Yes. And I believe the argument is that the identity itself is a kind of competence. That's the argument. And I've never really, I've tried to figure out how they're making that argument. I guess it is this lived experience that you both were talking about at your SAFS presentation. Is that because that's the argument I think that's being made, is that your identity somehow gives you expertise in this particular area. Is that expertise seen as being due to your lived experience? Is that how it's argued?
I heard a lovely analogy about this that helps me understand it. It's about the oppressed has a broader view than the oppressor, because the oppressed has the lived experience of their oppression and also can see what the oppressor's doing. And it's a bit like color blindness. And that the oppressed sees this full spectrum of color, whereas the oppressor only sees maybe one dimension of color. So that the oppressed has the full view, the oppressor has the limited view. But that's cute, and that helps you understand what they're saying. It's harder to understand how that constitutes any sort of epistemic adequacy in a discipline at a university,
especially in something like physics. like I can sort of see it a little bit from a sociology of knowledge perspective, that certain questions are asked, and if you don't have different experiences, then certain questions are going to be not going to be entertained just because they're not thought of. So that seems to me to be a fair. Now, in terms of your ability to actually verify and have methods which are rigorous and so on, that seems to be another issue. But certainly from the actual kind of research areas and questions and so on, perhaps. But when you're getting into the STEM fields, I don't understand this at all, especially in things like mathematics and physics, because your ability to see a whole bunch of different colors or that kind of thing, that's not really going to affect your ability to understand black holes or something like that, I don't think.
But Francis, I mean, let's even talk about humanities. When I entered into the humanities and social sciences, And I was studying Christianity and media because I was coming from a tradition within Christianity myself. I was held to a standard where I had to employ what was called bracketing. They said, you need to divulge who you are, what you stand for. I had to do this in my limitations when I would publish a paper to show that I was not bringing my personal biases to the research. So it was mandated by some of the editors before I could get my work published that I actually removed my personal standpoint to make my research valid. And I think that there's an argument there that you simply want the information to speak for itself, that you are not trying to have an axe to grind, or you're not putting your thumb on the scale. And I think in some cases it led to me being a more rigorous researcher. But now we're actually saying that for some people, this idea of, we want you to put your thumb on the scale, we want you to not bracket your particular biases. I've seen enough of critical theory scholarship that shows these people have a conclusion for which they go out and find evidence. And that's not the way this is supposed to work.
Yes, and that's really, I think, Boghossian, Pluckrose, and Lindsay, that's sort of what they said about their hoax articles, was that they started with this conclusion and then they went around trying to get whatever, kind of rationalizations they needed for that to happen. So I think that's definitely, part of the postmodern kind of method, if we're going to call it a method, is to do that. Anyway, I don't want to miss, because this is the major kind of interest that besides all your activities, but the Wilfrid Laurier situation, which I think one of you, I'm not sure which one, in your SAFS presentation, which I highly recommend. Unfortunately, there's some technical difficulties to that presentation, but the content is excellent. The most politically correct university in Canada, is that how it's kind of understood?
It's such a tight race right now. I just don't know if we can make that claim. I think Queens is making a hard move to the inside, and
yeah. I don't know. You guys have a special history that you can rely upon, which the history is the Lindsay Shepherd affair.
Oh, and even probably, before that,
yeah,
Francis.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's when you became that's when it all kind of became solidified, I think. But I'm not sure if our listeners know what happened there. So I was wondering if you could just explain what went on with the Lindsay Shepherd affair, which is quite an interesting case study all in its own right.
Sure, I'll start and then Will can jump in. So Lindsay Shepherd, a grad student doing her master's program in a critical theory master's. It was something critical theory and culture or something. And then she had a TA-ship. And by the way, let's preface, even before I move ahead, Lindsay was a lefty. She voted Green Party. She was a vegetarian. She was pro-choice. She was, she had all the bona fides of someone on the left. And in her job as a TA, she showed a video that had already aired on public television, and it featured Jordan Peterson against another professor from U of T. And essentially, Peterson was saying that he would not be compelled to use pronouns when he wasn't wanting to use them. Made up pronouns related to, he was saying the new pronouns that extended beyond him and her. So he just said that he wouldn't be compelled to do that. It was in relation to Bill C-16. And this other fellow from U of T was saying that it was a must that you do this because, in fact, male and female were not real anyway. So this was the debate, and she showed this clip. And the reason she showed it was, at the time, she was teaching a tutorial on pronouns. And she thought, let's make this interesting and timely. So she did that. Well, it came to be known by her professor that she'd aired this clip, and then her professor, the chair of the program, and an equity officer got her into an inquisition session where they accused her of things like transphobia for having shown this video that had been seen by hundreds of thousands of people on public television. They said that she'd done harm. They said that she had violated our university's, it's called the gender and sexual violence policy of the university. So they accused her of these many things for which expulsion might have been the consequence. She had the presence of mind to record it, and then she released it to the media. And it was clear that these professors were intimidating her. They were saying things that were not true. She'd not breached any laws of Canada. She, in fact, had breached the gendered and sexual violence policy only because it was an error of law. I mean, it was the gendered and sexual violence policy we had at Laurier was illegal, related to what the laws of the land said should be. So anyway, all this came out, and eventually it led to incredible tension within her classroom. Will, you can pick it up if I'm missing any of the details there.
She was ostracized by her professors after this. There was going to be in-class presentations of the major essay, and students could choose who would be present, and none of her classmates chose her. So they all made their presentations without her, and then she made hers privately in the office. So she was, I mean, that was just nasty ostracization by the faculty.
Well, there was also a public letter, if I recall correctly, or wasn't there a public letter from faculty?
From the entire Communication Studies Department, an open letter signed by every single faculty member on the side of Nathan Rambicana and Pimlott against
her chair and professor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was that letter? What did that letter say?
Just that they utterly supported, they were against Shepherd and supported the faculty members who had said the most outrageous things. David didn't even get to all the crazy. They said that quoting Jordan Peterson was akin to quoting Hitler, and that there were certain ideas that we just don't discuss in universities.
That weren't up for debate. His exact quote was, there are some ideas that are not up for debate.
Yeah, and this is kind of getting into what you're talking about, David, about how, there is quite a significant proportion of faculty who think some ideas just shouldn't, they should be suppressed. And we're seeing that, all over the place with a whole bunch of different topics, which aren't even, I can think of some topics like, pedophilia and so on. Obviously, it seems to be a horrible thing to be talking about, but at the same time, I wouldn't say, well, that should never even be examined, because then there could be all sorts of things that are close by to that, but we're talking about the trans issues, which are the most obvious, which is the existence of biological sex, the sports issue. Well, David, I know you're having some troubles with, being able to even have a debate, questions people taking one side or the other about whether, people who are born male should be able to participate in women's sports, for example.
And remember, at its heart, all that we are supposed to do at university is to teach our students to examine both sides of an argument. This is what we do. And insofar as we restrict the ability to see the other side, we fail as a university. And with the Shepherd thing, it's coming back to me, and I can't remember, maybe Will know, I can't remember if it was in the letter itself, but I think it might have been. There were claims that because Lindsay had shared this video, there were now faculty who supported her who were receiving death threats. Was it something like that? Yes. Okay, so Global News and another news outlet actually contacted the local police as well as the campus police and said, has anyone come forward and said that they received a death threat or any kind of claim to hostility. They said, no, no,
And
no
so
professor.
that would be the supporters of Ram Buchanan and
That's right.
Finlay, right? So people who were supporting them, the claim is that they were getting death threats and threats of violence and all sorts of things like that.
But when the news media actually asked the police, has anyone come forward with these threats, these claims of being harassed or harmed? None. And so the reason I bring that up is they say that in any battle, truth is the first casualty. Well, it was evident that these people were very pleased to use any means necessary, including fabrication, in order to build their case. And they, I mean, so that was the least subtle way to do it, by making false claims about having aggressive hostility foisted upon them. But
And
the other
complaint
thing
itself, from what I understand, is that Shepherd was told that there had been complaints filed about her talking about this, having this open discussion about pronouns in her class, and there was no such complaint.
no, that
So
was
they
a
just
lie
made
as
that
well.
up.
Yeah.
So that's a very important point, because you know, in all of these kinds of things that are going on now across the country, Rima Azar's case being the one that just, we don't, unfortunately, Rima Azar, that's been settled, so we will never know what actually happened there. But in many of these cases, the complaint is withheld from people. So you shouldn't really have to go into anything, any kind of process or anything, until you have that complaint, because it's possible that that could just be completely invented and doesn't even exist.
Often they are. And for people who are watching this, if they don't know about how critical theory works, or some of the main tenets of critical theory, one of the tenets is that things like objectivity and truth are akin to white supremacy, right? And this is this whole redefinition of the language. So you try to take something that was once virtuous and repackage it as something that's villainous, and that's how you can get rid of it. And so we see this on display in the Lindsay Shepherd case, in that they don't really believe in truth anyway. So when they say that that there were death threats, I felt like there were death threats, therefore my reality was death threats, right? It's a great way to live. I just wish I could say, my reality is I feel 6 foot, therefore I am 6 foot.
Yeah. And
but yeah, so this is the whole, if you take lived experience to its nth degree, you get fantasy land. But you get fantasy land that is backed up by academics and university policy.
Yes. So
in a sense, they were telling the truth, though, because they didn't, well, they alluded to physical violence, but they really meant epistemic violence, right?
Yes.
And that the campus wasn't safe because of the ideas.
Yeah.
But they, you know, in a typical postmodern way, they weren't clear about that, right?
Yeah, and it's quite common now. People's making these statements. I was just on an event a couple of weeks ago, which was called Queering Indigenous Land-Based Learning. That was the title of it. And it was Alex Wilson was the person. Anyway, so Alex Wilson was not able to attend, and so they showed a video of her event, you know, a previous presentation on the subject. And in the question and answer, because one of the things that was the word that was used was epistemicide. That was the word. So I'm not sure if you've heard that word, but I've heard it quite a bit in the Indigenous kind of policy area. Anyway, that means, you know, killing of a way of knowing. So like if you have a, you know, if you're a creationist, for example, and you know, and then you go into an evolutionary biology course, that really is epistemicide, because your kind of worldview and your way of knowing will be destroyed by, you know, critical thinking and all these sorts of things. So this, I don't think this was all that prominent 5 years ago, but now it's just being asserted as if it can't. And also, if you question it, oh, like then you're going to really get it. Because now, here are these, people that are making these claims. They're trying to assert themselves. They're opposing oppression. And here you are with your questions, your violent questions, destroying their, way of knowing, etc. So that's quite I think that's kind of a recent development where it's become much more aggressive, this kind of approach.
It's definitely been more pervasive, if not more aggressive.
Yeah.
And I would say that every time Will and I get into trouble, it's simply because we pose the same question: can you show us the evidence?
Yes.
That's when we get in trouble. So our president, during the height of the George Floyd controversy, so George Floyd was the Black man who was killed by police officers. They were kneeling on his neck, a tragic death. And so there was a movement on our university campus then to say that we too were complicit in the violence that was happening to people of color. And the statement actually read that our campus was systemically racist. And so Will and I, we wrote a public letter, and we challenged what was being said by our president. And one of the main challenges was, could you show us the evidence, the quantitative data? And for our trouble, we had a group form, a mob form of citizens and faculty and students called WLU Changes Do, calling for our firing, because in asking that question, we'd proven that we were racist. That was their claim.
Yes.
And there we have a new definition of the word racism, of course.
Yeah.
As I was saying earlier, the whole project of the left seems to be the creation of new definitions, and these definitions don't correspond to reality.
Yes.
And that doesn't matter. But this was another example where we were now, for asking that question, that was clear evidence we were racist.
So why do you think that, and this is something I'm really interested in hearing you guys' opinion on, why do you think that that's a project of the left? This kind of this word distortion process. Like, first of all, I think we should say, what do you guys think the left, like when you think of the left, how do you define left?
What do you think, Will?
Well, so I go back to what you were saying earlier, Frances. It's actually part of my evolution on this comes from knowing you, because traditionally you're the left and I'm the right, and here we are, allies in this fight. So it's obviously not about that dimension. It's about that. So who it was, Brett Weinstein was in his congressional testimony, was talking about there's a two-dimensional, two axes here. X-axis is left and right, the traditional, but the Y-axis is that authoritarian libertarian you were talking about. And I think that's the primary axis of disagreement, I think. But I've been listening to a lot of James Lindsay, and he keeps sourcing a lot of woke into Marxism. You're not going to want to hear that.
No, and actually I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day who was talking about Lindsay's book, Race Marxism, or something.
That's his new one. Yeah.
What is it called? It's something about Marxism, but racial Marxism or something like that. I think I haven't read the book yet, but I think he's confused. I think a lot of, because I do appreciate a lot of what Lindsay has to say. But I think on the Marxism question, this is one of my major points of contention that I am taking up in my own work, is that the whole historical materialism, I should be clear, I don't like to use the word Marxism, because I have met many people who will say things like, but Marx didn't say that, or like they'll quote you some passages, like that's not really the issue here. The issue is whether the theoretical character of the ideas, whether their evidence supports them or not. Like that should really be seen what it is. And if you look at the actual theoretical character, it's highly tied to economics and property and ownership and development, historical development. And that's why Marxism is really at odds with, or historical materialism is really at odds with much of the post-colonial types of theory, because that rejects historical development and the idea that modes of production progress. So capitalism is more advanced than feudalism, like that sort of idea, which is part of the theoretical nature. So all this woke, like trans issues, how on earth did trans issues have anything to do with property relations, developments and modes of production? It has nothing to do. I can't see any linkage.
I see what I understand what you're saying, Frances, and I think that when we use the term the left, it's a heuristic that allows us to quickly let people. We can use the woke. We can talk about the woke left. We could call it the social. Sometimes social justice warrior is used as an epithet for these particular people. It's but digging into it, I'd say that there's. If I said, what is it about the one side versus the other? I mean, what do you, I, and Will have in common?
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have a couple things in common. We believe in the free expression of ideas, that both sides of debate should be heard, which was traditionally an idea of the left, not a conservative idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. But the other thing that we were very much in favor of is evidence, empirical evidence,
yes,
and as close to objective empirical evidence as possible. And we believe that you can move toward that. It's the Enlightenment idea. The Enlightenment idea is that we can separate ourselves from our particular ideologies and try as best we can and succeed to find what the statistics are saying, what the factual evidence, what the quantitative data is saying. And then we just let the chips fall where they may.
yes,
And so that is our team. Our team, if I had to sum it up, that's our team.
yep,
And I'm happy to be on that team.
yep. And me too. And if historical materialism is flawed and the evidence doesn't support it, then I'm going to have to give up that theory, right? Just like I assume you're, I'm not sure how similar you and Will are in terms of but it would probably be some neoclassical economics perspective, the market, the importance of the market in terms of progress of humanity and how planned economies have problems with them and those sorts of things, right? That would probably be your, or some kind of similar kind of theoretical perspective. Is that correct or no?
Well, for me, I think that I'm more comfortable with wealth redistribution than Will is. Will is definitely more on the libertarian side of that. And I think, I look at going back to the original ideas of just gentle or simple socialism that you saw in the policies of FDR, for example, which is more of a Keynesian proposal. I think that it has its place at certain points. I'm not sure where. I mean, I don't want to go down the path of economics because I'm not an economist, but I'm comfortable with those things. I mean, I'm very Canadian in that respect.
Yeah.
But I look at the problems that we're seeing, and they, yes, are partly economic, but incredibly tied to culture now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so what the reason why I was asking that is that if you found evidence that, capitalism didn't work, like capitalism was fundamentally unsustainable and so on, then, if you were if we're on the same team, it would be, well, I have to give the historical materialists their due, the labor theory of value and so on. But those are, and my point is that those are very, very important debates that need to go on. But until we sort out this ideas being able to be expressed, we're not going to be able to have those debates because we are
Right.
shut off from all sorts of information. Information is being withheld because of these, I call them politically correct totalitarians. Woke, I think people understand now, which is basically identity politics that has become totalitarian, right? So identity politics, intersectional kinds of these things, critical theory, this is all part of wokeism that has been now declared to be true, and everyone has just got to promote it in the universities. That's basically what's happened.
It is a rejection of factual evidence that makes us uncomfortable, right?
Yes.
And this is a very religious idea.
Yeah, well,
It's-
dogmatic, certainly.
It's very dogmatic, but again, it's everything that's old is new again, or everything that's new is old again, or whatever that expression is. I mean,
Yeah.
everything that's happening right now, you could say, well, this looks like the Catholic Church of the 1800s, or this looks like, choose your authoritarian presence. And this is not a slag of the Catholics, because they actually work through some of this stuff.
Mm.
And they get into Vatican II, and between 62 and 64, and they're trying to work out some things. But we see this impulse within communities to, as they grow more powerful, to ensure that the opposing message just can't be spoken. It's kind of in our nature. And
Mm.
it's the exception when we override that nature.
Yeah, I think this is the big struggle right now. And actually, my friend Christopher Nagel, who is on the program, very interesting guy, he's got a book called The Secular Fundamentalist. He sort of sees what's going on as kind of similar to what happened in the time of the Reformation. So when Protestantism was breaking away from Catholicism, there were and I didn't even know this, it would be an interesting history to look at, Oxford and Cambridge. And I believe one of them was Papist and the other one was Protestant. And there were these wars that were going on between those two universities, very, and that was and this is perhaps what we're going to see a little bit. I'm hoping, because I think there is a significant open inquiry coalition. It just has to be organized in a certain way, which I don't want to forget to ask you this, because this is, I think, is a major thing that could happen, which is about your local chapter for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. So for people, the audience members who are unaware, we all belong to the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which is kind of the most significant organization in Canada for defending academic freedom and open inquiry in universities. And when I was talking with Mark Mercer, the president, I was sort of suggesting one of the ways perhaps forward is to really work on developing these local chapters of Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And I understand that both of you have developed a local chapter at Laurier. And I was just wanting to ask you about how that's going and what's happening with that.
Well, Will has been driving that almost single-handedly, so he can give you all the info.
I just was intrigued by the conversation you were just having, and I just wanted to throw in a couple of thoughts before I turn to the local chapter. I think maybe what unifies us is more fundamental. It's about whether or not objective truth exists, and whether we can learn about the world that we're in and arrive at truths about that world. And I think we all agree that we can. And this is what distinguishes us from the woke. There's a lovely quote from Delgado and Stefanchek's introduction to critical race theory, right at the beginning of the book, under the section titled, "What is Critical Race Theory?" And they say that critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Well, that's kind of getting a little bit, because there's truth. So I totally agree. Is there an objective truth or not? Like that question. If you say no, we can't, that's the end of it. Like you can't continue on the conversation. So I think that's the big dividing line. But when you get into the kind of the legal principles and everything, that then starts to become complicated in the discussions between historical materialists and classical liberals. That's where the next argument is going to be. But we're still at the objective truth side. Like we haven't got to that. We haven't sorted that out yet. So that's the first kind of battle that really has to be fought, which I think with all the kind of, discussions about left wing and all that, that gets everything sidetracked.
Yeah.
Because then all the left wing people get all sheer, irritated and everything. And then it begins, it's not really the main thing that has to be talked about right now. So I think that's an important thing. So, so the local chapter, what's happening with that?
Okay, well, I wasn't really ready to talk about it, but we have a website. And you're like the fifth person. Like I haven't really publicized it yet. It's WattSAFs, so WaterlooSAFs.ca. We even bought the domain name, so yeah, we're in business. My goal with it is to show what's going on at the universities at Laurier and UWaterloo, largely to ridicule it. I think that I was listening to a fascinating discussion between Eric Smith, the professor of rhetoric, and Benjamin Boyce that was just out recently. And Eric has been ostracized from his colleagues in the rhetoric discipline. And so he's adopted this approach of ridicule. And he was very deliberate about describing it. He said, it's not disparagement. Ridicule, it always has a justification. It always has a reason why. And it therefore invites a response so that the conversation isn't shut down. Now, the object of the ridicule might feel a bit wounded, but there is something for them to argue back against because there is a justification. And that's kind of what I want to do with this site. And so what we've got on it right now is all of the articles published by David and I on topics relating to the university and free speech. And we have 25 or so going back to 2016.
We are the voices crying in the wilderness. I wish someone else would write some of these.
Yeah.
Like the body of work is quite spectacular, and just organizing it on the website's been challenging. And we have videos and podcasts, of which there are about 10 or a dozen of us talking to, Jordan Peterson in one instance, to guys like Andrew Lawton. And then one topic that bothers me immensely is university administrations using their soapbox to proselytize for their own political opinions. So I make a point of ridiculing that. Well, there's one that I just discovered. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to show you. I'm going to click on the page like you can see it. Of course you can't. I'll just describe it. The University of Waterloo last May announced that there is a climate emergency. And they just said, we announce the entire university, it's official, and urgent action is required. And of course, one of the things that they are careful to point out is that the climate crisis will compound existing social and economic inequalities, blah, 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 right? So it's got a nice woke dimension to it as well. And I just, that bothers me because this is a really contentious issue. we probably all agree that the globe's warming, but what to do about it is the more important issue. And to declare it an emergency and say urgent action is required kind of shuts down rational debate. You know, the time for careful contemplation's over.
Because if I say, well, no, I want to slow down, I want to discuss this, suddenly I'm evil.
Yeah.
You know, what's wrong with you? There's an emergency. Why are you not acting? The house is on fire, as they often say. Why are you not rushing in to save the children, you evil man?
But who are you? You're David Haskell, professor of liberal arts. This is the University of Waterloo, one of Canada's foremost engineering schools talking. David, there are 50,000 students and faculty there.
I know, and then it makes it very difficult for the minority position or the critical position, because then you're seen as someone who's not really part of the universe. Like it actually has an effect of ostracizing kind of framing that goes on with it, and that's what happened to me with the things like the residential schools. But like that puts a target on your back, because then all the woke element can start to really mobilize against you on that basis. So on that note, we're coming to the hour. We're coming up to the hour. So I think what I'll do now is I think that's given our audience a lot of things to think about. We got into a lot of different ideas. So now I'm going to turn it over to both of you, and you can ask me questions, either completely new ones or follow up on some of the things that we didn't really discuss as much as we should have. Anyway, so take it away, both of you guys, and you can ask me questions.
Okay, before we get into the more nitty-gritty of your situation, which I'll let Will lob the first question there, just a general question, Frances. Okay, so you asked us some questions about, do you think that there's this silent majority who may actually be for free speech? And we gave our answer. Here's a similar kind of question. Do you think that there is a corrective actually built in to all of this woke nonsense? Like, is there something, a poison pill within it that just says it can't sustain itself, that it will have to correct simply because, I don't know. Well, what do you think? That's not a really fine-tuned question for you, but is there, if we did nothing, would things get better?
No. I think the corrective is coalition building and organizing, especially outside of the universities. So I think there is quite a large members of the public who are quite alarmed at where things are going. There's a lot of things now happening in the school system, which is there's mobilization against wokeism in the school system. So that's kind of, and that's what I talked to you about with Mark Mercer, is that I think that the local chapters, and I think that's excellent what you guys are doing. And I'm very, very interested in your website. I'm going to be looking at that and then promoting that for Mount Royal, to develop a Mount Royal SAFS chapter, and helping other universities do that, because that'll give on the ground support. But as equally important is the connections with other groups outside of universities. There's a very important group called Lighthouse that I'm involved with that is trying to take on wokeism in the school system. And then you have international kinds of elements as well, like the Free Speech Union in the UK, and which has been very successful in some ways. That's an interesting organization to look at. FIRE is a very important organization in the United States. Of course, the National Association of Scholars, and FAIR, which is the
Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which is very difficult to find on the internet if you don't know that they actually are called Fair for All.
Okay, Fair for All. Anyway, that group.
Yeah, I've directed people to.
And they have a lot of powerful people that are involved. So this is kind of like the herding cats kind of problem that we have. Like the
Mhm.
activists, the woke activists are already, because that's what they do. Their life is, organizing things and going forward and manning the barricades and so on. Whereas the people who think that there's an objective truth, like that kind of foundational thing, that's a very hard thing to organize people on the basis of, and you have very, very different kind of perspectives. So that's really what has to be done. I think I'm pretty convinced that's where it's got to go. And it's frustrating because, just in my own case, trying to organize people to, sign something which is rather innocuous, which, will allow me to use the faculty center and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Like trying to, because people say, what's the upside? I can see the downside, like it's gonna not be good for me, and I'm gonna be seen as a supporter of this, that, but there's gonna be no benefit to me to do that. So like that's kind of the, like saying, hey, you think you can keep your head down, you're gonna be able to live out your career, but the university is gonna crumble. Like universities are crumbling, and all these kinds of things that you took for granted 20 years ago, they're not going to be there anymore, and you're going to be looking over your shoulder constantly, and you're going to have students mobilized against you if you don't do what they want, and all these very, very terrible things, which most of these people in kind of the mushy middle, they're not really aware of that. So I think that's kind of the key, is the organization and coalition building that has to happen.
I get a kick out of the people who use the pendulum analogy, and the pendulum will just swing back, just from momentum. We don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, there is some truth to that. And I think the truth to that is eventually when everything crumbles, like truly, when we go back to the Dark Ages, when they're, where full Lysenkoism takes over, which that's a reference to a biologist who was very critical to the Soviet Union and their food supply. And he had these ideas that were ideologically pure and biologically nonsense. And so anyway, it led to incredible starvation. Eventually the reality does come back, but it's going to be who are the people dressed in loincloths trying to rebuild the civilization at that point.
Well, there's a couple of things where there's interesting turns that are happening. One is trans activism, and all the people who had dysphoria, who if they just got some psychiatric help and so on, would have kind of lived through it and gotten over it, who now have gotten on this stream of hormones and body parts being chopped off and so on. That is going to be a huge scandal when that starts to break, because of the kind of enthusiasm that's been building up, which I think is starting to show there's problems with that now.
In the UK for sure. Yeah.
And then I think that as well, the residential schools thing is starting. There's mobilization against that, and you can sort of see that it's the rent seeking aspect of it is very, is key to why this is happening. And because everyone's so afraid to sort of ask questions, it's just moving ahead at a rapid rate. And I think that's going to be something that's going to discredit this whole kind of everyone that's behind this kind of.
I'm really interested in that topic, and I would like to hear more of your thoughts. Is it Jaime Rubinstein who just came out with a piece where he looked at the list of dead residential school children in BC and hunted down death certificates for about half of them? And actually found out, well, of course they aren't missing, because he found death certificates, and most of them died innocuously, not at the school, during summer holiday, drowning while swimming or something. And then the archivist for the Truth and Reconciliation process actually wrote back and said, "Don't hassle me anymore. I'm not going to answer any more emails from you."
So I'm involved in a research group of about 15 people And there's a woman from Kamloops who is extraordinary, who just is a dogged, like she is digging through all the archives, and a lot of her work actually has helped many people in this research group. And Jaime Rubenstein is one of them. And he has a Substack about the residential schools. If you just type in Jaime Rubenstein and residential schools, you'll get his Substack, and he is just, feverishly pumping out, one article after another using all this research. And the three of us, Jaime, myself, and Rod Clifton, are presenting at Civitas. And I think that's going to be a breakthrough kind of moment. It's astonishing, and David will, what you've been saying about journalism about this is shocking. The journalism on the residential schools file is absolutely shocking. And this research group sends out, I think it's 100 journalists, information basically every week, just providing the, factual information. And, they're getting it, like they're receiving it, but it's not changing. Like the Pope visit, all this, like this is crazy. And, especially the Kamloops case, which I think is the most extraordinary, hoax. It's just obviously not true.
What I would say, even within this, is just to kind of put this into context, because I've read your work in this area, Frances, and your heart is for Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mean, and all of us, our heart is for people who are disadvantaged, are people who are being done an injustice, truly an injustice.
Yeah.
But where we would take a look at these things is saying that it's within the pursuit of truth, it's in the pursuit of both sides of an argument, that those who are truly harmed can find true justice. And that's what we want. We're like, I know that people listening to this often are thinking, well, they're out to get this person or not. If you can show me where injustice is, I want to join you to fight that injustice. I don't want to think that there are children who were harmed who are not receiving the benefits that they should receive. I don't want to think that there are people who are in a position of gender dysphoria who are not getting the care that they need. But at the same time, I want both sides to be heard to make sure we're not doing something that is equally or perhaps more devastating to people, and it's sort of like, unless you have the competing ideas, what you think you're doing that is good, if you're doing it in the absence of both sides, it might actually be the opposite.
Yeah. And
well, I just want to toot our horn here. Our track record speaks for itself, David. When Lindsay Shepherd was attacked, we went to her defense. So, when people are oppressed, we're there, we step up to help.
Yeah. Well, I think with, like this is sort of the difficulty with things like the residential schools research is the Indigenous policy, the whole background is obviously one where terrible injustices have been committed. And you have conditions now, and this is the marginalized population in the isolated communities, state of emergency circumstances that exist there with, fetal alcohol syndrome, very, very low educational levels, economic dependency, and so on. And this residential schools kind of unmarked graves thing that came about in, I guess, starting in 2021. Now the demand is for money to be sent for more ground penetrating radar studies and consultant reports and all sorts of things like that. That's not going to do anything to address the terrible conditions that exist in the communities. So
but it's worse than that, because they're obviously lying to us. They're misrepresenting the truth about the number of murdered children. And so that undermines support for the initiatives that might do some good on the reserves.
Yeah, and this is the problem is trying to get the things back on track in terms of, evidence-based discussions before there's this kind of backlash where it's going to be blamed on the marginalized members of the community, when it's really the privileged, what I call the neo-tribal elites that are benefiting. So there's the neo-tribal elites, which are the leadership and generally the academics. You see the prominent academics who really, their lives are not very different from all of our lives. Like we have very similar kind of economic, social circumstances. They're speaking for the marginalized. In fact, they use the marginalized to buttress their own position, like to enhance their own position within sort of the power structure of academia and all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, the industry, huge mass of industry players, lawyers, largely lawyers, but also, so consultants and so on. So this is part of this drain of resources that has been going on, I guess, starting in the 60s and 70s, which is largely being turning, the Indigenous policy area into a legal kind of slush fund for various players within the system. Meanwhile, the conditions in the communities, like that's what's got to be looked at, is that, what are the conditions today in the communities compared to, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And, I haven't done any studies of this, but I can't see how they would be improving, because the main factors that you would determine would be the cause of improvements, like educational levels and economic opportunities and so on. Nothing like that has really changed for those isolated areas in Canada.
Mhm.
Yeah, meanwhile, indigenization of universities progresses, which just strikes me as just about the most useless policy response to help the Indigenous on the reserves that you could possibly conjure up. We're setting aside academic positions, but do we even know there's enough Indigenous PhD students out there to even fill those positions? And then that goes to, high school and finishing high school and elementary school education. And
yeah. And in fact, it justifies, to some extent, a justification of the lower level of education that exists in Indigenous communities. That's one of the arguments that I put forward. So, on the one hand, we have all these terrible problems, education being one of them. And then we have the universities, which are saying, okay, we're going to, reserve these kinds of positions for Indigenous, scholars. How is the reserving of the positions for Indigenous scholars going to improve the circumstances for the marginalized members of Indigenous communities? And I guess they would say, well, it will give those Indigenous students in the communities something to aspire to. So that's kind of, I guess, the one argument that they would put forward, like that by seeing.
And I'm not, and incidentally, I'm not opposed to that argument if you can just show me empirically that it works.
Yeah.
Right. Again, I'm very open-minded, and I think that the heart of every researcher who has compassion is, our goal is to make a better society.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do it at the expense of the evidence.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it because ideologically I have a conclusion. What I want to do is, I don't want to do what feels good. I want to do what will do good.
Yeah.
And I think that we just keep coming back to that as people try to make villains out of academics like us, who really are saying, well, I'd like to see the evidence. Well, you're not, you don't care. No, I do care. But I look at the historical record that says all of these different policies were put in place because they were said that they would do good, or they felt good, they felt right.
Yeah.
And then they did extreme harm.
Yeah.
And so all I am saying is we need to have these open discussions. We need to have both sides heard to make sure we don't keep making those mistakes, because it's in the deficit of evidence that we make the mistakes.
Yes.
So, I just keep coming back to that. I want to see the world get better, but not at the expense of evidence.
And as well, your argument really is that it is through evidence that we make the world get better. Like
It is.
how will we know that we're making the world better if we don't have the evidence that shows, okay, yes, when we did carve out these positions, when as you increase the number of positions of Indigenous scholars in universities, then the educational levels in the isolated communities improve. There's a correlation of some kind, but that hasn't been shown. And I was just thinking, as I was saying that, I think there is a more destructive argument that is being put forward as well, which goes to the heart of the university, which is that it is this kind of science and, quote unquote, Western ways of doing things that is really responsible for the terrible conditions of Indigenous people. Like, I just heard that argument being made at this queering Indigenous land-based education. This Indigenous scholar was saying, this science with its absolute truth, and this is what is severing us from our land and fragmenting us and doing this and doing that. Well, what is an Indigenous person who's trying to get an education and so on, how are they supposed to how are they gonna respond to that? They shouldn't go into the sciences, and sciences are this horrible thing that have destroyed their culture and have separated them from the land, and so it's got a very anti-scientific kind of character to it, which I don't understand how that is going to have any benefit at all to anyone within the university.
Yeah, woke strikes me as a particularly bad lens for looking at Indigenous issues because they are anti-capitalists, and it's really going to be economic opportunity that's going to free Indigenous to be independent and conquer a lot of the social problems that they're experiencing.
I don't think they're anti-capitalist. What makes you think that they're anti-capitalist?
It just seems to go hand in hand. I frequently see they was celebrating climate strike. The climate strike people wanted something called climate equity. And then you dig deeper into that, and it turns out that they reject all market-based solutions to climate problems. So, no carbon tax, no cap and trade, blah, blah, blah. So I just see this as a recurring feature of a lot of the woke advocates, that it's married to a kind of anti-capitalist worldview.
Yeah, well, there's some of that. There definitely is sort of a romanticism, but a lot of it is just getting the non-Indigenous people, or asserting ownership, asserting Indigenous ownership over various things. So often it's a maneuver to try to extract more transfers in various ways. Yeah. So it has a pretense. It's got this kind of pretense, but in the end, the demand is for more Indigenous, control over royalties or whatever, the kind of extractive, sort of rent-seeking character. Like, there's a lot of rentierism. Yeah, that is part of the argument. So it's not so much of an anti-capitalist kind of argument. It's more of that the ownership, it should really be the Indigenous landowners who were able to rake off a share of, profits and so on that are going, like, this is many of the arguments that are made, but it's true especially in the academic world. There's a kind of a romanticism about how, and this is never very clear, about how hunting and gathering traditions were much more sustainable than capitalist ones. But then it's like, well, what about the universities and hospitals and so on? Like, are you going to have, a hospital with hunting and gathering? Is that, how is that going to work? Because you have no productivity, of course, in there, or the productivity is much lower in hunting and gathering modes of production than in industrial ones and so on. But yeah.
Yeah, I just read Peter Best's book recently, and he talks about some of the conflicts in Northern Ontario, mining companies who tried to move forward with a project, and then the duty to consult was just a great big holdup. And some of the projects just don't go ahead because the demands are too high to make it economic.
Yeah, and this is kind of like, I wonder when, this kind of, the demands are, I don't know how that's going to work itself out within the system, that projects are just not happening because of all the uncertainties and all. And there was also, and Best, of course, is this is his area, looking at all the and it's actually the government. So the government, sort of helps the Indigenous groups to make demands off of the various resource extraction types of industries, even more so than what's really required. So it's kind of an interesting, sort of nature of the rentierism that's going on, the whole kind of Indigenous file. That his work is very interesting, actually, on this kind of area.
We've got a vice president of Indigenous initiatives at Laurier now, and we've seen more and more Indigenous seminars. I tuned into one. It was in the biology department, and he was ostensibly going to talk about property rights in Northern Ontario, and then it ended up just being a ramble. But the chat was closed.
Yes.
These are all on Zoom because there had just before that, there'd been another Indigenous biology seminar where somebody asked a quasi-challenging question, and it ended up devolving into a conflict. And then after the seminar, attendees were invited to stick around for a smudge ceremony.
To heal from trauma. There's an interesting piece, which you've probably seen, on the Ottawa Law School.
Yeah, I just read that this morning.
People should take a look at that. I found that to be very disturbing, and that gives you a bit of a sense of the property rights, the whole area of property rights. Seraphin is his name.
Yeah,
Stefan Seraphin, the University of Ottawa. Anyway, and this again is where we're going to get serious problems. He was trying to teach about property rights and the assertion of crown sovereignty and so on. Obviously, very controversial topics in Indigenous, the whole Indigenous legal file. But he was doing it like sort of the Lindsay Shepherd kind of approach, and you guys' approach and everything, which was, this is just an argument that you should consider. Like you're going to be going into law, so you should sort of know what the argument would be from the basis of, if who would argue in favor of that the Crown did assert sovereignty. Anyway, he got I believe a number of students filed a human rights complaint against him for, considering, not even teaching this as being the truth, but just presenting it as one argument that existed alongside other arguments, and then looking at the other arguments too. But this is, and so now he's decided he's just going to give up the courses where he was going to be teaching that, because they're trying to impose this kind of, indigenization, decolonization perspective, which is, as we've said many, many times in this discussion, is about, the truth has been found. This is what the truth is. Now it's just about getting everyone to, accept that as being true, which is very, very dangerous for the whole thing. But this is really where it's going. And you can sort of see the danger to academic freedom and open inquiry when that becomes kind of the dominant position. Certainly the administrators seem to be running with this. I'd be really interested to hear what his colleagues think about it. Like, I know the administration is pushing this, but what do the other professors think about this? This is kind of getting back to the question of what percentage of professors are actually on board with this kind of wokeism kind of program.
Well, that's story is really frightening, because to be on the receiving end of a human rights complaint,
yeah.
The deck is stacked against you. Their bias is for whoever's complaining, and it's worse. They're proposing to add an Indigenous component to every first-year law class.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't even want to teach first-year law anymore, because you lose the academic freedom to even control the content of the course you're teaching.
Yeah. So human rights, that's one area. Harassment policies is the other one. So have you guys had any, has that tickled your area yet? Have you?
Oh yeah. It's I hope David restores his connection back to us, because he's just had a terrible time of sort of analogous to yours in some respects, that the students are filing harassment claims just based on the essay topics that he's assigning, and they threatened a human rights complaint against him as well, and it startled me. I didn't think that was possible. I didn't even think the human rights really had any purview over the content of courses at a university. I could see it would have purview over an employment relationship, a discriminatory employment situation. But what they're trying to do here at Laurier is weaponize harassment complaints to get students to complain about faculty. And there's been this curious development. The AVP of diversity has posted an essay, which I think he wrote, but it's unsigned, and it hangs off of the main diversity webpage, and it also hangs off of the free speech webpage, and its title is something like The Intersection of Inclusivity and Free Speech. And it's got some really disturbing content. Like the whole conception of free speech, here's a quote: "All members of the community should be able to speak out strongly against speech which marginalizes others." So the conception of free speech is that you would use it to call out and problematize others. And then it makes a promise at the bottom. It says, if students have experienced racism, hate, or oppression in the classroom, then there are avenues at Laurier to address concerns, see below. And then it's got links to all the offices, the Office of Dispute Resolution, the Office of the Dean of Students. So it's like, it's making a promise. It says, if you experience racism, hate, or oppression, then here's who you complain to. Yeah.
And there's lots of, like at Mount Royal, they just hired a person to head what's called the Office of Safe Disclosure. Which is, you go in there and, if you're feeling like, you don't know how to go and complain, then this person will assist you in filling out all the forms and doing all this sort of thing. And that was one of the demands. So in my case, it started after the George Floyd. So that was interesting. This was a moment in Canadian universities where there was already, movement towards this, but because there was this huge kind of reaction to the George Floyd case, they just they saw their chance and took it. And so in our case, we had this open letter that was making all these demands. One was mandatory anti-racism training for faculty. And then as well, this complaints, like they were sort of arguing that, it was too difficult to file complaints against professors. So they needed, they wanted to have sort of an area where they could kind of go anonymously in doing this. So, anyone who is kind of looking at that as a professor going, this is not, I can see where this is going to go, and this is not going to be a good environment to be trying to explore ideas in. And then, of that one, 62 faculty members signed that at Mount Royal. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the numbers who are, I would see someone who would sign something like that as being a rather, sort of a committed kind of authoritarian. Or, some people are naive. They just think it makes them look good or something, or it's just symbolic or something. I can't see how anyone would have signed that not knowing the kind of authoritarian kind of dimension, but you never know. And then there's, a significant group that would be, kind of sympathetic, but not willing to put their name on something in that overt a fashion. But this is kind of this kind of mobilization for complaints. You can see how, well, most professors just won't go, they'll just drop most of their teaching kind of controversial kind of topics or something. They're not going to do that. They'll just back off. So the self-censorship problem is huge. And then the people who do continue are just going to have targets. They're going to have targets on their back. And that's basically, but it's good for me. It wasn't like the students were agitating a lot. But it was really faculty members who weaponized the harassment complaints. Like that's generally what happened. Although, as I'm going to talk in Civitas, one of the reasons why I got fired was because of my satirical commentary on the unmarked graves, which was, I was satirizing woke academics who were comparing the residential schools to Auschwitz and like those kinds of highly incendiary kinds of things. So I was satirizing them doing that. Anyway, the Students Association got really angry about this, and as I know you were aware of this, who put out a press release denouncing me and said that I was creating a culture of fear and that I was misusing my academic power, and that they were afraid to take courses with me because I obviously would have problems grading fairly if I entertained this, condoned violent and lethal behavior. So this outrageous press release, which was about, my private social media activity, which was satirizing, highly, what I consider to be highly offensive kinds of claims, like that, 215 children were murdered at Kamloops, and residential schools were like KK, Canada was a Ku Klux Klan kind of, state, genocidal state. Anyway, Mount Royal said that press release, that's one of the reasons why I got fired, was that press release.
And we need adults in the room who can separate the BS. In the administration just will not step up. I found something related to your visit to Laurier that I had not known about back in 2018. For listeners who don't know this, Lindsay Shepherd invited the controversial Frances Widdowson to come and speak about indigenization. And the university organized a competing event at the exact same time. And then the president put out an email saying what a mark of how liberal and open we were that we would actually interfere with the student event. But the event was organized by the senior advisor of Laurier Indigenous Initiatives, a woman named Jean Becker. And there was a story in the student newspaper. That's how I learned about, and I just found out about this a few months ago. And here's a quote, I love this. Even before, this is Jean Becker speaking, she says, even before we heard that Frances Widdowson was coming, some of our students in particular, and some of my staff were really feeling a lot of fear and anxiety, because even when the conversation was just around free speech, it implicated Indigenous people right from the beginning. So what is it with you? Striking fear and anxiety into the hearts of people.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because as I've just been talking to you guys, and this is in the C2C journal by Peter Sean Taylor, where I was when I was fired, the night I was fired, I was terrorized after hours. After, you know, it was 5:30 and I was ambushed and you know, lured into this room under like an expectation of something else, and then my ability to leave was blocked, and I felt I was being forcibly confined, and I ran back to my office, and then this group of human resource people and the same guy who was blocking my way went over to my office, and there's 2 security guards at either ends of the hallway, and I was in this complete panicked state, and I ended up calling 911 because I was just so terrible. Like I was in a state of just complete panic, and they know, these people, that they're supposed to have union representation at any, this is no, and they keep on telling you at all, any kind of thing that happens, that, you know, you have your right to union. So they know this very well. That is an unsafe, this is an unsafe space, like that situation. But the woke people who are going on about how I'm creating a culture of fear through, you know, posting satirical commentary on my private Twitter account that no one even has to look at or anything, they think that is violent, and even criticizing an Indigenous perspective is this epistemological violence and epistemicide. And so it's kind of very strange, this lack of, you know, like, we're not really applying the same standards to try to understand things, which of course goes back to our, you know, universal truth, and having definitions that we can agree upon and that have some rootedness, and not just, you know, not just a completely new interpretation that just appeared out of nowhere, you know, these kinds of problems. So it's a very, very difficult environment now. And, you know, as I said, I think, you know, organization and bringing in outside forces that are also battling things in other sectors of society, you know, that has some possibilities maybe in trying to, you know, really deal with this really, really serious problems that exist in the universities.
Yeah, I think a lot of it stems back to safety culture, and we have to have adults who stand up and go, no, you know, satirical tweets aren't going to hurt you, you know, just thicken up your skin. We're not going to pursue a faculty member because you didn't like her tweets. And instead, every single time the administrator just bends over and accepts the complaint without evaluating whether there's really any merit to it.
Yeah. And this is a big thing, is that we need, and that's why it's so unfortunate about the case of Rima Azar. Is like, I was really interested to see how the arbitration was going to go for that case. You know, the defense of academic freedom, the defense of freedom of expression, the complete overreach, what appeared to be a complete overreach by, you know, Mount Allison's diversity, inclusion, and equity, you know, bureaucracy. And we could have got an arbiter to look at it, and then it just gets settled beforehand. So
yeah, all of her comments were on her blog, right? And really separate from her employment situation.
Yep. That was, there were some, which she said, there were some comments about how she wouldn't use people's pronouns and stuff in the classroom, but Azar, in the discussion we had, claimed that was all invented. So I think she's pursuing that through human rights complaint and so on and so forth. But most of it was these kinds of just saying what I consider to be very innocuous kinds of, you know, questioning systemic racism and those sorts of things on her private blog, not even as a, you know, like, that's the thing, is that I understand if the university has, you know, its own Twitter account, its own things and so on, you're acting as a spokesperson for the university, then, okay, that's going to be one thing. And actually, that was kind of amusing about my case, because when it first started to unfold, which was my defense, that's what really started things off, was my defense of Wendy Mesley's reference to Pierre Valier's book, White Niggers of America. Anyway, I defended Mesley by re-quoting similar things to what she'd done. Anyway, with respect to the Wendy Mesley case, I forget what what was I talking about? Well, I lost my train of thought there with respect to the Wendy Mesley. Oh, this is about Rima Azar, linked into the Rima Azar case.
Yeah.
Totally lost.
And just that she was doing it all on her private blog. In your case, it was a little bit different.
The MRU Education Twitter account. So there was this Twitter account, official MRU Education Twitter account. It started, supporting this mob going after me about the defense of Wendy Mesley. So if they're ever going to get concerned about, social media, but I was alerting them to this and saying, hey, what's going on with MRU Education? Why is MRU Education account being used for these purposes? And they let that go for, I think it was a month, and then finally they kind of stepped in because the petition was being circulated and so on. But that's kind of one thing. I totally understand. And then the funny thing was all the woke people got really upset about Mount Royal coming down on the person who was commandeering the MRU Education account, saying, she's, what about free speech? She's not allowed to have her opinion about this. It's like, well, she's got her own Twitter account.
Yeah.
She can do that on her own Twitter account. She's using the MRU Education Twitter account to, mobilize students against a faculty member and all sorts of things like this, used for her own political kind of agenda that she was using. So yeah, that was another kind of interesting aspect.
I just don't understand how they can use your Twitter comments against you. They're going to deem it harassment of another employee somehow. But I read a lot of those tweets. They were from anonymous accounts, and they were coming after you. And you were counterpunching, and I don't see. Then it becomes an interpersonal conflict. And then in that circumstance, I don't see how you can point at one side and go, oh, well, they were guilty of harassment. No. Now it's a barroom brawl at this point.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how well it stands up. People I talked to say, because they added in some workplace stuff at the end, which they're not going to win on because this is on, I've documented this because I have recordings of all the meetings. Since 2019, I recorded all the meetings, and they're claiming that I disrupted this meeting so much that they had disabled the chat function. Well, I recorded that meeting, and it wasn't me who was the problem in that meeting. And it was a bunch of other faculty members who were attacking me. So, but people have said the fact that they put in those workplace things at the end is an indication that they perhaps think the social media angle is not going to be very effective. But that was sort of my take on it. Was I've got a bunch of people calling me a white supremacist and a hateful harasser and an epistemic terrorist and all these kinds of terms, and so I'm just using their terms to refer to me and saying, congratulations, so-and-so. Yes, it's great that you are starting this petition to get this hateful harasser fired. Like that was kind of what I was doing. And I was using their words. So I thought, if they're using those words about me, and then I take their words and use it in a kind of a satirical fashion against me, like slightly exaggerate, like that's what I would do, is slightly exaggerate it and then apply it to me. How could that be seen as me being this kind of instigator and person who is creating this culture of fear and poisonous work environment? It seemed to me that it was my workplace. If we're going to call it work, which that's the other big issue, is that our universities now going to be going through all the tweets of their employees that they're doing on their own time and not they're not doing it as part of some course or something like that's like if you link it to your actual professional obligations, now that's when you're kind of entering into the workplace. But if you're just, having discussions with your friends on Twitter or whatever, like what are they going to go and like, this seems to be a huge kind of problem.
Yeah, there's no boundary.
And this is a freedom of expression issue. Are we supposed to, as professors, give up all our rights as Canadian citizens just to express opinions on things on our own private time that have nothing to do with our actual, professional obligations on campus? This is kind of another sort of issue. So I'm very interested to see how this is all going to be argued out. But
yeah, there's been a big change in the governance of the university. Like, the model used to be that the faculty were also part-time administrators and we kind of ran the place.
Yeah.
And that's just so gone now. It's a professional class of who you might even call rent seekers, who just travel from university to university. They're on 5 or 10 year contracts. They don't put down roots. They don't meet anybody. So they don't how do you pronounce your president's name? Riley. He evidently does not care two hoots about you. He doesn't care about the scholarship that you're producing, that you're one of Canada's foremost authorities on Indigenous politics. He's just got a bunch of noisy woke faculty that are calling for blood, and he's like Pontius Pilate. He'll wash his hands and let you get crucified because it'll just be easier for him to run the place after you're gone.
Well, this is part of the what's called diversity managerialism. So you've got all these conflicts that are taking place on the basis of identity. It's causing a lot of disturbances. How are you going to deal with this? One way, if you were going to have a true academic institution, would be, well, let's have a discussion and let's figure this out. Or you can try to suppress the conflicts that exist and manage them. So you have these managers that come in there who, use these policies, these harassment and human rights policies, code of conduct policies to do it. And the reputation of the university. So that was another reason why I got fired. Was it was being claimed that I had, tarnished the reputation of Mount Royal University when I think it was 5 years before they were trying to bring in a code of conduct, and they wanted that wording to be in the code of conduct about the reputation. And everyone fought against it. All the faculty members fought against it at the time because we knew that that was going to be used against those that, had kind of controversial ideas that, people were complaining about and so on. And that was seen as a very bad kind of possibility to have within the code of conduct. So we went from that kind of understanding that it was not good to have, sort of this idea of the university's reputation be something that's being used to manage faculty, to now when it's actually being used as a weapon. And it's not even, it just got pulled out of nowhere because it's not in the code of conduct. So I don't know exactly what where they're basing this upon. And then my favorite ones is that I refuse to accept responsibility and show remorse. Yeah, so it's the rat cage mask. It's time to bring out the rat cage mask, as I used to say on my satirical Twitter account. So
it's a watershed moment. I
anyway, yeah.
I just despair for what's become of the universities, and I have so little optimism because the woke have the run of the table now. The administrators are going along with them, and they all have tenure. They're not going to change, and they're hiring more of their brethren through these, inclusive excellence.
Well, certainly time is running out. As I say, totalitarianism is on the move. It's time to lean in, right? we don't have, we have a window, like it is still, the courts haven't been completely undermined yet. They're working on that, but that still is not happened yet. That's why having the arbitration happen like sooner rather than later is a good idea. As well, and getting some decisions that can rein in the universities, which I hope is going to happen in my case. And then, you're doing the work, you're doing the heavy lifting, getting your local chapter up and running. People can take a look at what you've done and use it as a model for their. See, so like it's not easy to do this, but it requires a lot of hard work and organizing. But that's what people have to kind of realize needs to be done. And I think if we could just get people to see the danger, give them some, not just like, oh, this is hopeless. Oh, what are we going to do? Here's what you can do. Some people in your university who are concerned about this. Why don't you form a local chapter and get things going? And then, working at SAFS and the national level to get different, that I think that really is what we have to do in the future to have any hope of saving the universities from, the fate which befalls them if we don't do something about it.
We're going to have an inaugural event for the Waterloo SAFS chapter. I'll send you an invite.
Yes.
We're going to get Charles Pincourt, who wrote a monograph with James Lindsay recently on wokecraft and how to identify it and fight it at your university. So it's going to be about those tactics, about how do you fight this. And I think the major one from his book is what you say. It's organizing people because one by one we can be taken out, but groups are much harder to take down.
On that note, on that optimistic note, I'm really excited about your chapter. I think this is a great idea. And university professors listening to this is kind of the model. And I know Brock, SAFS, there's a Brock chapter as well. There's a McGill chapter. Hopefully I can get the MRU chapter going as well, because we do have quite a few SAFS members at Mount Royal, and then work in the Alberta context. That is the future. So that offers us some hope for improvement, that things might be able to get right the ship and get things going in a more academic direction. It's too bad that David's internet connection conked out, but I think he was able to contribute a great deal to the first part of the disputations. But I really wanted to thank you so much, Will, and also David, for joining me today on the Rational Space Disputations.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.